Hello and welcome back. In this part of the tutorial, we're going to start building the form. So to begin, I'll open up the user component.ts file and start by importing the user service class as well as the user class. So user service as well as the user class. So next, I'll just go ahead and create a new user object. We are going to be binding this object to the form. Private user should be equal to new user. And I'll also just go ahead and inject the user service class in the constructor. So private user service of type user service. So next, before moving to the HTML code of the form, I would also just like to go ahead and include the Bootstrap module we earlier downloaded in the project. So to do that, I'll open up the Angular CLI.json file and add that under styles. So Bootstrap normally is downloaded in the Node modules folder. We can access it by typing node_modules bootstrap dist css bootstrap.min.css. So if for some reason you don't see the effect of Bootstrap, you probably need to rebuild your application. With that said, I'll open up the HTML file and start building the form. So next, I'll get rid of this and add here a form tag. We don't need the action. We're going to be doing that with ng-submit. And in this form tag, I'll start by creating a div with a Bootstrap class of form group. And in this div, I'll start by creating a label. And I'll assign this label a Bootstrap class of :2 form label. This will be a label for the email. I'll also add here email. This :2 here basically means that we are assigning this label only 2 columns of the entire container. Next, I'll create another div with a class of :10. This :10 here also basically means that whatsoever we are creating inside here will occupy only 10 columns of the entire container. So next, I'll add here an input field for the email. So input of type email, I'll assign it a class of form control. The name is email. We don't need the ID, but I'm just going to go ahead and give it an ID of email. Next, I'll bind this form to the user object. So I'll add here ng-model and set it to user.email. So you probably don't want to sit there and see me type in all this HTML code. What I'm going to do is I'll pause the video, then I'll copy this and repeat it for all the other fields, with the sole difference that for the password, the type here is going to be password, while for the other fields it's going to be normal text input field. So let me pause the video and do that. So I repeated the same procedure for all the other input fields. The last thing I need to do now is to add a submit button. So I'll just type here input of type submit. The value, I'll just call it create user. And I'll give it a class of btn success. And back in the browser, we should kind of have something like this. A nice looking form. Like this. So next, let's go ahead and handle the form submit. So in the form opening tag, I'll add ng submit. And I'll just call this method create user. Let's just go ahead and implement this method. So I'll just copy this and open up the user component.ts file and paste it here. So when the user clicks on submit, this method will be called. Next, we need to call the create user method from the service class and pass in this user that we just bind to the form. So this dot user service dot create user, and we pass in this dot user. Then we need to subscribe to this method, and we get back the data, or we get back an error. For the time being, I'll just go ahead and log this to the console. And here, console.log error. Let's test this in the browser. So back in the browser, I'll open up the developer console. And I'll try to submit an empty form. So as you can see, we get back a status code of 406, which means not acceptable. And if we open up the response, you can see here we got back the error messages that we defined in our backend object. So you see, please enter your age, please enter your email, and all the like. So next, let's create an actual user. For the email, I'll just type here samba@mail.com. My name is Samba Media. Password 123456. Age is 12 years old. Of course, I'm not 12. Number is 7 digits. Let's click on enter and open up the console. So back in the console, as you can see, we got back the user that was just created. So this is working, and the status code here, of course, is 200, which means okay. So let me try to create this same user again. So if I click on create user, and once more I'll open up the console. And as you can see here, we got a status code of 409, which means conflict, meaning this user already exists in the backend. So the next thing we're going to do is to display all of these error messages in the form. So back in the user component class, I'll start by creating the following. Private user error. This is of type user. It is going to hold the error messages that are written from the backend. And private is created. This is of type boolean, and I'll assign it false. And next, private user exists is also of type boolean. I'll set it to false. We are going to use these two boolean variables to control how to display if the user was successfully created or if the user already exists. So back in this create user method, when we get a status code of 200, this method here will be executed. For all the other two status code, this other method will be executed. So what we want to do here is to reset the form, meaning when we successfully create a user, we just need to reset the form. So in order to do that, I'll just type here this.user and set it back to a new user. By so doing, the input fields of the form will be completely resetted. Remember, we have a two-way data binding with the form and this user object. So the next thing we need to do is to set this is created here to true. And the user exists to false. So I'll just copy this and paste it here. And we also need to get rid of this boolean here. And also add here this dot and this dot. So if there are any error messages, we just assign it to the user error object we just defined. So this dot user error should be equal to error dot error. And we also need to set this to false. And finally, when we have a status code of 409, we also need to reset this too. So if error.status is equal to 409, then I'll just copy this 2 again. This means the user already exists, so I'll set this to true, and again set this to false. So all we need to do now is to display this information back in the form. So I'll open up the HTML page again. For each of the input fields, the errors should display only when they occur. To begin with the email input field, I'll start by adding here another div with a bootstrap class of :10, and the content of this div will be the error message for the email field. This should only display when it actually exists. So to do that, I'll add here an if condition. So if user error dot email, then we display the error message. I'm going to be doing that in a span. So I'll create a span here with a class of text danger. This should just be user error dot email. So in Angular, if this value is null and we try to display it like this, we're going to have an error. In order to solve this problem, all we need to do is to add here a question mark, which will ensure that this condition is also false when this value is null. So once more, I'm going to pause the video and repeat the same procedure for all of the remaining input fields. So I repeated the same procedure for all of the other input fields, and let's see how this looks like in the browser. So back in the browser, if I try to submit an empty form, you see we get the following validation error messages from the backend. So let me violate some of the rules here. And you see here we get a different error message. Please enter a valid email. So let me enter, say, also violate this. And as you can see, your name must be wrong. We got this error message from the backend. Excuse me. And if I also violate these rules, for example, this was a valid number actually. Let me add another one. You see here we get invalid phone number. So let's create a user without violating the rules. I'll change this to jut@mail.com. The name is test, password 123456, age is 13. I'll get rid of one of these and click on create user. So as you can see here, the form has been resetted, meaning the user was successfully created. But then we still have these error messages. This is because we forgot to reset the error object when the user is successfully created. So back in the code, all we need to do is add here this dot user error equal to new user error. By so doing, we reset that error object. So let's test this out and see. I'll open up the browser, and now if we try to create a new user, say so let me violate the rules once more. And now if we create another user, as you see, the errors are all gone. So the next thing we need to do now is to at least display some information here when the user is successfully created, and also an information when the user already exists. So just before this form, I'll start by adding here a div with a class of alert danger, and also a class of column 10. Then I'll add here an ng if condition. So if user exists, then all we need to do is to display the following message: a user with this email already exists. Then I'll just copy this and change this one here to alert success. This should be if is created. And the message here will be congratulations, your account was created. So let's test this out and see. I'll open up the browser and I'll try to create this user that already exists. One, two, three, four, five, six. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And as you can see, we get the following alert message: a user with this email already exists. Okay, now let's create a user that does not exist. I'll just add here 1122. Congratulations, your account was created. So guys, at this point, we are basically done with these tutorials. Once more, if you have learned something from these tutorials, encourage me by hitting on the like and the subscribe button. So until my next tutorial videos, see you.